One form of slave control is through slave laws. So let us recap. How the planters or the society would have tried to control enslaved people? One way of control was,
So
some
making
ladies,
them feel inferior.
yes, making them feel inferior. What is the broad heading for that? What are the different types of control? The broad subtopics that we look at. So inferior, that is correct. You're correct. Because if you're going to the exam and they ask the different ways in which the enslaved people, they try to control them, we have to give the broad topic. Or they could ask what are two economic ways in which they try to control them. So they try to control them socially, political, not political, socially, psychologically,
Physically.
physically, which other way? So we look at socially, psychologically, physically, what else?
Sir,
Psychological,
culturally.
Culturally, what else?
ideological.
Ideologically, very good. What else?
Sir, did you say economically?
No. So economically, and the next one is true
Sir, rewards.
rewards. And today we are going to look at the last one, which is legal control. Very good. Now, next is Baker here, Baker Brown Williams.
Yes,
Baker,
sir.
you can
Sir.
Yes,
share,
sir.
you can go ahead for me, share screen. So this group one is going to look at the British slave laws. Go ahead for me, please.
Sir, it's loading.
All right, no problem.
Okay.
British slave laws. What were the British slave laws? Why were they passed? Did all British territories have the same law and the British slave laws?
What was the British slave laws? In the British Islands, restrictive legislation against the coloureds were harsh and lenient in some cases in comparison with the French. The British laws, also known as slave codes, were laws enforced by British planters based on the 16th century English common laws which dealt with English felons, vagrants, vagabonds, and servants that absconded from their duties. The laws varied due to the various legislative systems controlling the country. In the mid 18th century, Jamaica had. Oh, sir, this part wasn't supposed to be in there, sir. Sorry about
Yeah,
that,
but
sir.
I can read it. It is good.
Sir, it was supposed to be in the other point to answer the other question, as in
All
if there
right,
are
then.
other laws.
No problem.
Jayla?
How were they passed? There was a mixture of scorn and fear amongst the whites towards the coloreds, whom were deemed as inferior and unequal. The purpose for passing laws were in order to stop them from becoming a powerful group politically, economically, and socially. The laws were passed according to the racial hierarchy on the plantations. The punishments for various groups differed from each other. For example, the mulattoes weren't given the same punishments as a colored slave, which would be as a result of the mulatto being the descendant of the plantation owner through the relations between a black enslaved and the whites.
Did all the British territories have the same law? The laws varied due to the various legislative systems controlling the country. In the mid-18th century, Jamaica had the largest and most brutal slave society in the British West Indies. On the other hand, countries such as Barbados were slightly a bit lenient in the administration and demands stated of laws.
The British slave laws. Politically, in all British islands, the colored were discriminated against by not being allowed to vote or hold political office. The enslaved were not allowed to own land or property. Slaves were forbidden to travel away from the plantation without a ticket from their masters giving the destination and time of return. Some laws stated that it was illegal to carry weapons. It was forbidden to blow horns, beat drums, and assemble together in large groups. No slave was allowed at white dances, racing meets, banquets, and other entertainments. They could not be taught how to read and write.
And now we have come to the end of our presentation. Thank you.
All right, very good presentation. Group 2, Christian and Davis. Christian is here, Davis is here. Christian. All right, so let us comment on this group. Group 1, I think you have answered the question. What was the British slave laws? You gave a historical background to the British slave laws. In fact, the slave laws were very spontaneous. Sometimes they were on the spot. These slave laws were also reflective of the conditions of slavery. Yes. I'm going to bring up a PowerPoint here just to explain a little more about the British slave laws. I don't want to come back to the British, to this slave law, where it is. So you would have mentioned quite a lot of the different things that the enslaved person weren't allowed to do. So you mentioned things that they couldn't own land and all of these different stuff. But part of the slave law that I want to zero in on is that if they strike a white person, the punishment was immediately death, and they could not practice. So any slave who shall pretend to any supernatural power in order to effect the health or lives of others or promote the purposes of rebellion shall upon conviction thereof suffer death. What are they talking about here? Any slave who pretend any slave who shall pretend to any supernatural power in order to affect the health or the lives of others, or to plan rebellion shall be put to death. What do you think they're talking about here?
Their religion.
Their religion. So if they saw them practicing their religion, then this is a British slave law. They were put to death. So they could not practice their religion. Also, the slave law, the British slave law said that every field slave on such plantation or settlement shall on work days be allowed to half an hour break for lunch, 2 hours for dinner, and no slave shall be compelled to any other field upon the plantation before the hour of 5 in the morning, or after the hour of 7 at night, except during crop time. What is this saying? What is it saying, ladies? It said that you can't go on the field before 5 in the morning, right? So it's 5 o'clock you go on the field, and the latest you should be in the field is at 7 at night. And also they are able to get breakfast, so they get half an hour for breakfast and 2 hours for dinner. So more than my lunchtime. My lunchtime is just an hour. These were some of the rules. Also, the planters were supposed, a part of the slave laws is that the planters were supposed to provide for the enslaved people food, clothing, and shelter. That was a prescription of the slave law, that the planter was supposed to take care of them. So in addition to the other slave laws that Group 1 would have presented, please add these additional ones. All right? Group 3. So we don't have a Group 2. Group 3, which is Denton and Groves. Go ahead for me, please. Denton and Groves?
Sir, are you seeing?
Yes, we are.
Okay, sir. French slave laws. What was the French slave law? This was a French law that governed how slaves should be treated. It was called Code Noir, also called Black Code, and it was drawn up in France. It was inspired by Jean-Baptiste Colbert. The law was promulgated in the 17th century. Yannick?
Okay, the French slave laws were originally passed by King Louis XIV. It was influenced mainly by the religious morals of the Catholic leaders that arrived in Martinique. It was applied to the West Indies in 1687 and Canadian New France.
Did all French territories have the same laws? Most of the French territories had the same laws. The laws were established in France and was later brought to other territories like Haiti and many more.
Examples of French slave laws. Jews could not reside in French colonies. Slaves were not allowed to possess weapons without supervision of the master during hunting. Slaves belonging to different masters must not congregate under any circumstance. Slaves must be baptized in the Roman Catholic churches. Children from married slaves were still slaves belonging to the mother's master. Masters may chain and beat slaves but must not mutilate nor torture them. Slaves must not sell sugarcane with or without master's permission. Husband and wives with their children under one master must not be sold separately. Master must provide food, clothes for every slave, including sick and old. Freed slaves who harbor fugitive slaves will be beaten by the slave master and fined 300 pounds per day of refuge given.
This is the end of our presentation.
Very good, very good. Thank you very much. What from Denton and Groves? You have seen the presentation from group one by Williams, who also did that present? Williams, Brown, and Baker. What is the difference or the similarity between the British and the French, from what you can draw so far, from what you have heard? Look at them. What do you think? You see anywhere in the British slave laws mention anything about family life?
No, sir.
Yeah, you're correct. So you realize that the French slave law, you see anywhere in the British slave law mention anything about the enslaved people being supposed to get baptized or be converted to Roman Catholicism?
No, sir.
No, no. Thank you very much, Brown. So what are we seeing? So we can, so far, we can see the differences between and the similarities between the French and the British. And so, and also a part of the French slave laws established that you should ensure that the planters provide for the enslaved people food, clothing, and shelter. That is a similarity between both the British and the French. All right, Edwards and Harley, group 4. Edwards here. All right. Group 6, Layla and Lorraine. Tell us a little bit more about, tell us about the Spanish slave laws. Layla is here, Lorraine.
What were the Spanish slave laws? Okay. Spanish slave laws were called Las Siete Partidas. In the Spanish slave laws, the enslaved African was regarded as a person as well as property. The laws therefore offered him protection against unwarranted assault or punishment, or other forms of inhumane treatment by his master. The basic difference between the Spanish slave code and other slave laws was that the Spanish acknowledged that slavery was contrary to natural justice and that it was an evil, but a necessary evil for the economic development of the colonies. How was it passed? The Spanish slave laws were passed through colonial legislature. Did all Spanish territories have the same slave laws? The Spanish had a slave code for their European territories because they acquired possessions in the New World, and they simply transferred this code to the West Indies. Examples of Spanish slave laws. Audiencias were instructed to hear cases of slaves who claimed to be free and to see that justice was done to them. When slaves of mixed blood were to be sold, their fathers, if willing, should be allowed to, but Their fathers, if willing, should be allowed to but them so that they might be freed. The slave had a right to his provision ground with the consent of his owner. He had the right to marriage without the consent of his owner. A slave master could lose his property in the slave could be freed if it were proven that he had maltreated him. Slaves could be compulsory manumitted for contain kinds of abuse, for example, the violation or prostitution of a female slave by her owner.
You're through? All right. Next group, group 7, McLeish and Morgan, similarities and differences between the French and the Spanish slave laws.
Sir, are you seeing my screen?
Yes, we're seeing your screen, but there's one issue. We're just seeing your sharing screen. We're not seeing the PowerPoint.
Sir, what?
We're not seeing, do you have a PowerPoint that you're going to share?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, but we're not seeing the you are sharing screen and we see internet stuff. So click on the PowerPoint now. Good, we're seeing the PowerPoint now.
Similarities and differences between the French and slave laws.
One second group, is it the French and which slave law? Because isn't
Sir,
it
the
similar-
Spanish, the French and Spanish.
slave law? All right, go ahead.
Similarities. Point 1. The slaves were treated more humanely with the Spanish and French slave laws, and this caused them to work more efficiently. Point 2. They had similar movement restrictions, marriage restrictions, and prohibitions on gatherings. Differences. Siete Partidas and Code Noir promulgated at different times. Point 2, their legislations were different. Point 1, the slaves were treated more humanely with the Spanish and French slave laws, and because of this, they worked more efficiently. It was simple. Improved labor and living conditions would make enslaved persons more efficient workers
lengthen their working lives, and reduce acts of resistance. After condemning the traffic on the grounds of justice and humanity, Hamilton sought to convince British readers that abolition would be economically beneficial as well. Sugar exports from the British West Indies could be maintained or even increased, he wrote, if only those already enslaved were treated better. Arguing for the creation of an empire whose slave codes were Code Noir and slave code Laissez Partidas, he encouraged British lawmakers to imitate the French and Spanish, whose slave codes contained treatment, government, discipline, morals, and religion for Negroes. This shows slaves were treated more humanely with the Spanish and French slave laws. Point 2, they had similar movement restrictions, marriage restrictions, and prohibitions on gatherings. Although the French and Spanish laws granted better situations for the enslaved, they still had certain laws to abide to. They could not marry people of their race or different races, and they could not have gatherings on or off the plantations. This is how the French and Spanish
One second for that point. You sure that they could not marry people of their race? For the French and the Spanish? The persons are presented on the French and Spanish slave laws. What's your take on that? Just a second. The French slave law, Denton and Groves. Denton is here. Groves. But Denton is not in the class. Groves. Ladies, anyone in the class, were persons in the French colony, enslaved people in the French colony and the Spanish colony, were they allowed to get married? Hmm?
Yes, sir.
Yes, they were. Yes, you are correct. They were allowed to get married. So once you're in the French and the Spanish colony, you were allowed to get married. So for that group, just erase when you get time. They could not marry people from different races. So that part is correct. But they were allowed to get married to people within their own races. So enslaved people were allowed to get married. Very good. So they could get married in their races, but not in different races. And in fact, the reason why the French and the Spanish slave law allow enslaved people to get married and you could not separate their families is because the French and the Spanish the laws were very Roman Catholic based. It was very Christian based. The British slave law had nothing to do with Christianity. That's why you are correct. The group that presented on the Spanish slave laws, they would have mentioned that the Spanish slave law acknowledged that the slavery was evil, but they're doing it because of economic reasons, because there was a Christian element to it, a Roman Catholic element to it. All right? Please note the differences. Continue. You're doing a good job thus far. Continue.
This is This is how the French and Spanish slave laws were similar with gatherings, marriages, and movement restrictions. Siete Partidas and Code Noir promulgated at different times. The Spanish law Siete Partidas was promulgated in the 13th century in Spain, and the French Code Noir was promulgated in the 17th century. Siete Partidas was the most important law code. It was based on Roman law and contained discourses on manners and morals and an idea of the king and his people as a corporation. Superior to feudal arrangements with the king as agent of both God and the people. The 1789 Spanish Code was successfully and formally abrogated by enraged colonists throughout the Spanish Empire shortly after it was promulgated. And its protective provisions continued to be suppressed in the Spanish Empire throughout the 19th century. As for the Code Noir, it was first promulgated in 1685. The Code Noir was France's law code that attempted to govern relations between slaveholders and the enslaved, circumscribing in a series of 60 legal articles the power of enslaved people. While the JCB owns many editions of the Code Noir, this 1743 edition is the earliest in a series of handbooks that includes not only the original 60 articles, but also the 1724 Louisiana version of the code and associated regulations concerning trade, administration, justice, and policing in the French colonies. The temporal breadth of this collection, not to mention their distinct shapes and sizes, allows scholars to understand the way the audience for this kind of handbook, including merchants, planters, lobbyists, royal policy advisors, colonial administrators, evolved over time and what they considered to be the broader legal ramifications of the code. This shows the codes were promulgated at different times. Their legislations were different. Louisiana experienced a variety of different legislations from different European countries, including the Spanish rule and the French rule. Las Siete Partidas consisted of a variety of laws pertaining to more than just slavery. However, those laws that were aimed toward the practice of slavery were actually for more lenient and humanizing of slaves. Surprisingly, the Las Siete Partidas allowed slaves to own their own property and to gain relief from cruel masters by means of petitioning to be sold to another owner, while the Code Noir, which was the law that governed the region when under French rule, protected the slaves by implemented laws with regards to the proper treatment of slaves, with a maximum number of hours for labor and Sundays off. Children of slaves that were under the age of 10 were also protected from being taken away from their mothers. This code was eminently practical. It focused upon how to control the slaves through police measures, established the obligations of masters to feed and clothe their slaves, and restricted the master's right to punish the slave. These protective measures did not stem from humanitarian concerns. They were aimed at controlling mistreatment and exasperation of slaves to avoid theft, running away, and revolts. This shows that their legislations were different. That is the end of our presentation.
Thank you very much. Very good attempt, McLeish. And McLeish, Morgan, both of you did that presentation together. Thank you very much. So I'm going to, we have a few more minutes. I'm going to take group 8. What were the similarities and differences between the French and the British slave laws? I'm going to ask you in your notebooks, do your reading, write, put all the slave laws for the British, all the slave laws for the Spanish, not all of them, but not at least a few of them. Do the similarities and differences between the French, the British, and the Spanish. Go ahead for me, Marston and Norman.
Wait, excuse me, sir. You skipped group 5.
I did?
Yes, sir.
Oh my bad. Sorry about that. Which is Emmons and James. Go ahead for me, Emmons and James. So Layla presented, yes or no? And Lorraine. So McLeish, so is group 5 a skip? Okay. Go ahead. But so Edwards and Harley didn't present. Go ahead for me, group 5.
Sir, are you seeing my screen?
Yes, we are. Yes, we are.
What was the Spanish slave laws? Spanish slave laws were local laws made by the government in Europe and not the planters in the Americas. These were to make sure the Spanish had full control over the livelihood of the Africans, however, not as chattels like the other Europeans, but as inferior human beings. How were the laws passed? Unlike other European countries, Spain's laws can be traced back to before the settling of the American colonies. Their slave law, called the Las Siete Partidas, was written in the 13th century. The law was based upon a code drawn up in the era of the Christian Roman Emperor Justinian. The code was set out to find the middle way between slavery, which denied the slaves of their rights, and inciting the slaves be treated as humans and protected by the law. It also stated that the slaves must be taught the Catholic faith and had a priest present at all religious gatherings. Las Siete Partidas, Castilian statutory code which established a body normative code for the kingdom, originally called the Libro de los Leyes up until the 14th century when the name changed. Its influence extended to the Latin American colonies. Spanish laws in the colonies. The Las Siete Partidas was made to apply to all American colonies, as this demanded the slaves being treated as humans and not chattel, and the enslaved could buy their freedom if they were able to. The recapitulation in the 1680s set limits
on the slaves' livelihoods. However, at the same time, it stated that they must be baptized in the Christian faith and were encouraged to marry. The cedula, the 1789, was issued in all the colonies. Cuban and Central American planters, however, did not like the idea of the slaves having proper living spaces. The young people below 17 years and the adults over 60 not working, and the slaves receiving no more than 20 lashes as punishments. So the law was withdrawn in these colonies. In Trinidad, this law was also not practiced by the planters. Free colored were treated more mildly than in other European colonies. They also held jobs as minor officials in Spanish colonies. In Trinidad, however, free coloreds were allowed to have slaves, but this was for the benefit of the whites. The Spanish slave laws. The Spanish slave laws were local laws in practice in Spanish colonies similar to those in other regions. These slave codes were laws that entailed the rights and duties of free people in regards to those of the enslaved Africans. These laws included the Las Siete Partidas, the cedula, among others. Slaves were treated as humans and not as planters' property. They were given the right to be taught the Catholic religion and refrain from work on Sundays and holy days. Some laws, however, set limits on the slaves' rights to meet together, to move about and carry weapons. However, at the same time, the slaves were encouraged to marry and instructed to practice the Christian faith. The free coloreds were granted small positions in the government system in the Spanish colonies and were able to have slaves in the few colonies. The laws were passed as the Spanish government recognized that slavery was not a natural state for human beings. The codes passed that treated the slaves as actual human beings were mostly ignored by the planters. On paper, these were perfect upgrades, but in reality, the slaves were not given the privilege to enjoy a bed and a blanket with only 2 persons in the room, and whatever age one was, they were expected to work. The laws passed were sometimes observed, mostly when they benefited the planter. The Spanish slave laws were perfect on paper, but in reality they barely differed from the harsh treatment the slaves received in other European colonies, as the Spanish government were not in the colonies to watch its progress.
Thank you very much. That was a very detailed presentation of the Spanish slave law, very detailed, and I like all the fact that you talk about that they were allowed to attend churches. Yes, that was a requirement under the Spanish and also under the French. And so the group that did the comparison between the Spanish and the French slave laws, they have a lot of addition to make under those points, because the Spanish and the French slave laws were so similar and lenient, because in the Spanish slave law, persons were not considered property, as you said in your presentation. They were considered human beings, same thing for the French. But in the British, they were considered property and not a human being. And so there are differences in the slave laws right across the board. So when we meet, we can't do all the presentations today because time has expired. So when we meet again tomorrow, we're going to continue the presentations. But ladies, I sent a document to you with the Spanish, the French, and the British slave laws. read them and look at the similarities, write them down. There's also a very good book, which is Lest You Forget. I think it is the one on the resistance and revolt. That book also has some comparisons in it. Please read the textbooks. All right, ladies, enjoy the rest of the afternoon.
Thank you, sir, and same to you.
Yes, see you tomorrow morning.